Hi, welcome to our grasping PowerPoint. This is going to go along with your textbook, Chapter 17 and 18. Chapter 17 is on hand development and Chapter 18 is on handwriting. So we're going to talk about the development of grasp and all the different kinds of grasps. Grasps are influenced by our primitive reflexes and how those are or are not integrated. We talked earlier in the semester about all the primitive reflexes. ATNR, as you remember, is the reflex that allows you to reach and touch what you're looking at. So that is the beginning of grasping, because the child is going to turn to look at something. Their ATNR is going to cause them to touch it, and then they're going to attempt to grasp it. And the grasping reflex is another reflex that impacts on the development of grasp, and that's the if you remember, that's the one where you stroke the palm of the hand and the child grasps, like when you put your finger in a baby's hand and they grab your hand with their little fist. Again, that is going to, from a reflex perspective, get the child to do their first grasping of an object, usually a hand, but also clothing, hair, whatever they get in their hand. And then they start to understand what that feels like to have something in their hand and what that grasp experience is. So the earliest grasping that an infant does is quite young, when they have the grasping reflex and they grab whatever touches the palm of their hand. They learn release in the avoiding response. The avoiding response is when there is a bright light and they move away. When there is also a grasping avoidance response where a child will let go reflexively, and that helps the children begin to release. The traction response is when a baby is on their back and you put your fingers out and they grab both your fingers with their hands and then they pull themselves forward. That is getting the baby to start to understand to pull an object toward them. So they're going to grasp an object, bring it up, usually beginning to their face and mouth, and they can then begin to explore what it smells like and what it tastes like and feels like in their mouth. So these reflexes and responses allow a child to start exploring things with their hands, which allows them to start interacting with their environment and leads to the development of more mature grasping patterns. The other thing I would note here is that children who don't have some of these reflexes or responses, if they're absent, then the child's going to obviously have a much harder time interacting with their environment. And if some of these reflexes are obligatory, for example, if the grasping reflex becomes obligatory, then the child's not going to be able to open their hand up again to learn how to release objects. So they're going to kind of be stuck in grasping, and they will not probably be able to move to more refined and higher level grasps. They're going to be stuck at that whole hand grasp. So when reflexes are obligatory, as I said a moment ago, they're going to inhibit midline orientation, which inhibits the ability to manipulate objects at midline, which is required to see it in front of your face and to taste and smell the object, which is how young children explore things. If the ATNR, for example, becomes obligatory, the child won't be able to regard visually objects in their hands. They will be stuck in that ATNR position, and when they go to bring the object in front of their face, they're going to turn the other way because that arm is going to flex. So it inhibits voluntary exploration, midline exploration, inhibits grasp and release, and can inhibit the ability of a child to move to those higher level fine motor grasps. So children move from reflex to purposeful movement. They start moving proximally and then control more and more distally. And when we're looking at grasping, we're looking at that more distal response. We're looking at control to be in the fingers and the hands and out from the core. In order to use those distal movements, you have to have decent postural control. There's some motor planning certainly involved, and motor planning, again, is the ideation and the execution of complex motor tasks and how long it takes somebody to get to that automatic state. One of the other things that children are learning when they are moving from grasping reflexes to purposeful grasping is coordinating their eyes, their hands, their mouth, getting all those parts to work together. And certainly that sensory exploration is how babies first learn about their world. Grasp development, as with other development in babies and young children, is not linear. Sometimes a child will be working on one skill before they have mastered the one previous to it. So it's not always in a linear way. A child may be starting to learn how to use single word phrases and gestures together and then start working on walking. And they haven't completely learned all there is to know about talking, but they're going to start working on walking. And then maybe when they get to walking, they're going to start working more on the verbal skills. But they didn't finish walking. They haven't learned how to jump, skip, hop, run. They just learned how to walk. So sometimes a skill isn't totally refined before a child will add the next skill onto it. So we have to be aware of that when we're looking at kids in their development. So here's some of the grasps. You should have pictures of these in the handout from the grasping book. And if anybody wants to purchase the Development of Hand Grasp book, it's an awesome book and has photos and descriptions of all the different grasps. It's quite comprehensive as far as that goes. Also, it has lovely pictures of the anatomy of the hand in there, which is very helpful. Anyway, so 4 to 5 months, we're going to have a reflex squeeze and a crude palmar grasp. And be sure to be looking at the pictures while we're talking about this. So take a moment to go get those out, that handout out, so you can be familiarizing yourself with these grasps. So essentially these grasps, the reflex squeeze, the crude palmar, and the palmar grasp are all right around 4 or 5 months, and they're in the ulnar or center of the hand. So they start in the ulnar side. The crude palmar grasp is more ulnar in the grasp, and then the palmar grasp is more central, and then the radial palmar grasp is more on the thumb side of the hand. Again, our development in our hand works the same as the development in the rest of the body. Is it's going to go from gross to fine, from crude to more specific, general to specific, and in particular in the hand, the development is going to go from ulnar to radial. So the radial, the thumb and pointer finger side of the hand, is what I call the business side of the hand. That's where we do most of our higher level hand functions. That's where we do opening and closing of fasteners and clothing. That's where we write. That's the primary where we type. Almost all of our fine motor skills happen at that thumb, index finger, radial side of the hand. So that grasp is going from ulnar to central to radial in that whole hand grasp. A raking grasp is fingers abducted and extended, and then a whole hand pulls in. So the difference between a raking grasp and just a plain grasp with your fingers is that the fingers are splayed out in full abduction, and then they come in and adduct when they flex. A radial digital grasp is when we're moving toward the fingers. It's still down by the PIPs and the MCPs. It isn't yet out at the DIPs or the distal pads, but it is still on the radial side of the hand. The next one is the developmental scissors grasp, which is a little hard to see. Essentially, it is between the medial side of the index finger right around the PIP and the thumb. So, and the distal end of the thumb pad. They're sort of together there. Inferior pincher is between the pad of the index finger and the pad of the thumb. A pad to pad and inferior pincher are pretty close. They're hard to distinguish. Some people place the inferior pincher more at the DIP and the pad to pad on the pad past that. I think that's a bit of a small nit to pick between the inferior pincer and the pad-to-pad pinch. But there is a difference between the pad-to-pad and the tip-to-tip. So think about pad-to-pad as how you would pick up a cord. Like if there's a small cord from your headphones or something, you would pick it up pad-to-pad. But if there's a pin on a tabletop, a needle or a pin, you're going to use tip-to-tip. Right, so you're going to use the very tip of your index finger and the very tip of your thumb. So imagining picking up a hair or a pin or a needle from a tabletop, that's your tip-to-tip pinch. And please note that that's at 12 months. So 12 months is young. a 12-month-old, a 1-year-old can use a tip-to-tip pinch. So if you are not seeing a tip-to-tip pinch in a, for example, preschooler, you know there's a significant delay going on. The other really important pinch or grasp to know is the three-jaw chuck. Three-jaw chuck grasp gets its name from a drill. So I don't know how many of you know what a drill looks like, but when you take the bit of a drill and you put it in the place where the bit goes, the place it goes into is called the chuck. And if you look at it, there are 3 pieces of metal that when you tighten the chuck, they grasp the bit that has gone in there. And your middle finger, index finger, and thumb come together to form that same sort of 3-sided grasp. So a three-jaw chuck is using the pad of your middle finger, the pad of your index finger, and the pad of your thumb to pick something up. So imagine picking up your glasses. You would probably use that. Imagine picking up the end of a marker, right? Taking the end of a marker off, you would use a three-jaw chuck grasp. It's a very, very commonly used grasp. We use it a lot. Let's take a minute to talk about in-hand manipulation. In-hand manipulation is a set of different kinds of grasps that are achieved through using the intrinsic muscles, the small muscles in your hand. So they are inside your hand and you have to be using those muscles carefully. Finger to palm translation is moving something from your fingertips into the palm of your hand. So if you are picking up Cheerios and you pick up a Cheerio and then you grasp it with your 5th and 4th and maybe 3rd finger in your palm, and then you extend your index finger and thumb and you pick up another Cheerio and you place it in your hand, so you're hanging on to 2, and you go pick up another one. So every time you move that Cheerio into your palm to hang on to it, that's finger to palm translation. Palm to finger translation is the opposite. If I give you a handful of beads and I say, get a bead out, and you get a bead and you use your thumb and you push that bead along the sides of your fingers until you get it between your index finger and thumb, but you're still hanging on to the other 3 or 4 beads that are in your hand, and now you have one in your index finger and thumb. That's palm to finger translation. Shift is when you are holding a writing utensil, and when you first pick up a writing utensil, maybe you're holding the eraser end of a pencil or the clicking end of a pen. You move the writing utensil down. So you kind of scrunch your fingers and your thumb, you extend and flex your fingers and thumb so that your hand grasp ends up down at the point end of the writing utensil. That's called shift. Simple rotation is winding a toy, or the turning motion when you're holding a bottle with one hand and you're unscrewing the cap. The simple rotation is that turning motion where your fingers kind of flex and turn, and your thumb goes forward and out, so and your wrist is going into some ulnar deviation, right? That is simple rotation, or winding a toy. That's that same motion. Complex rotation is when you flip a pencil to erase, and that's all complex rotation is. So if you hold your pencil and now you flip it upside down so that you're going to erase, and then you flip it back the other way, that's complex rotation. And here are the ages for those. So complex rotation is the highest level age-wise, and it doesn't come into play until kindergarten, 1st grade. That's when children are using writing utensils more purposefully, and that's when they learn how to do complex rotation. If you look, a 1.5 to 2-year-old can do palm to finger translation. Finger to palm translation, sorry. They can pick something up and get it in their palm and hang on to it and then pick up the next thing. Going the other way, taking something out of your palm and bringing it to the fingertips, is a little older, a little harder. So shift on a big object. So if a child is turning a big knob on something, that's 2 to 2.5 years. And shift to turn the pages of a book is about 3 to 3.5. So that's when you're able to hold several pages and slide your thumb and fingers apart so that you only have one page, and then turn the page of the book. And so simple rotation on a jar lid is 2 to 2.5 years. And a wind-up toy is a little harder because you have to hold a tighter pinch, and there's more pronation, supination involved than in a simple rotation of a jar lid. So in order for somebody to successfully write, you have to have in-hand manipulation, you have to be able to shift, you have to be able to do complex rotation, right? So you need some of those skills. You need visual motor skills, which is the ability to copy shapes, copy letters, copy designs. So you need to be able to see an object and have a motor output that matches that. You need to have good visual perception, which we're going to talk about going forward. Fine motor coordination skills and perceptual motor skills. What else do we need for handwriting? Good posture. Remember we talked probably in the first semester and probably again in the second semester, you talked about the balance between stability and mobility. So you need to have a stable base off which you can have high-level mobility. If you don't have a stable base, then you can't be mobile off of that base. So good posture is the stability so that we can sit in a chair and sit at a table and have the freedom to do very complicated, very high-level fine motor tasks, such as writing. You need to be able to balance in that chair and not fall over. You need both hands to be integrated together, bilateral integration, because you have to hold the paper, stabilize the paper with one hand while you're writing with the other. And you're also going to be crossing midline, right? When you're writing across the paper, you're going to get to the midline and you have to keep going. So since our words go from left to right, if you are right-handed, as most people are, not me, but most people, you have to cross midline every time you start a new sentence. So both of the sides of your body have to be well integrated together. So you cross midline to start writing, and then you come across midline as you finish writing that line, and then you cross back over again to start your new line. So that's required for that. Motor planning, of course, is needed for that. Kinesthesia, knowing where your body parts are in space. Tactily, you have to be okay holding the utensil. You have to be okay with whatever paper it is you're using. And you're going to be getting proprioceptive feedback from the writing activity through your hands and through your body, and you have to be able to process that information. You need to have a stable wrist. So I want you to practice at the table here while you're listening to me is first put your hand down and write your name, and now lift your wrist up off the surface and write your name so that your wrist is not, your forearm is not stabilized. The only thing touching the surface is the pen tip or pencil tip. So you can see how much harder that is. So we need the wrist to be stable, and we need the forearm to be supported on the writing surface. You need to have stable arches of the hand. So in your handout that you have that I gave you from the Grasp Development book, Developmental Grasp book, if you look, there are arches of the hand that go from radial side to ulnar side, and there's an arch of the hand that goes from the base by the wrist up to the finger, so it goes from proximal to distal. So those arches, the lateral arches that go ulnar radially, and then the vertical arches that go proximal distal or distal proximal, right? So the arches. So when you hold your hand out there, your hand, if you look at your hand, it's not flat, right? You can see those arches in it. And even when you try really hard to flatten out your hand, you really can't. There's still a dent in the middle, right in the center of your palm. So you can't fully flatten it out even if you try. And that's what a hand should look like. If you ever see a hand that is flat, 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 you know that there's a problem. You need to have good arches because those arches allow you then to oppose, right? If you didn't have the arches of the hand, you couldn't bring your thumb and your fingers together very effectively. It would be very hard for opposition to happen. So you need good stable arches of the hand because when you're holding a writing utensil, if you look in the hole that's produced, so hold your pencil for a second, or marker, whatever, in a dynamic tripod or in a tripod hold, which is index finger and thumb flexed and resting on the middle finger on the medial border of the middle finger, right, sort of the standard pencil grasp. And if you look, there is a circle created by your thumb and index finger, right? There should be an opening, a hole created. Now, some of you have a closed web space and you don't have as much of a circle, but make one so that you can see that. And when you look in there, you can see the arches of the hand and how they help stabilize that grasp. You also have to be able to separate the two sides of your hand. So if you put your hand down on the tabletop on a piece of paper and you make some vertical lines, you'll notice that your pinky and ring finger and that whole ulnar side of the hand aren't moving much, right? They're pretty stable. Whereas the radial finger and thumb and probably middle finger, the radial side of your hand is very active. It's moving. So you need to be able to be stable on one side of the hand and mobile on the other. So you have to be able to function with the two sides of your hand separately and be doing two different things. Clearly you need some upper extremity strength. Depending on the writing utensil, using a marker requires less strength than using, for example, a pencil. Crayons require more strength than ink pens. A rollerball pen is going to require less strength, right? So there's a certain amount of resistance on the paper. And if you used a crayon on a very rough thing like fine sandpaper, you would need a lot of strength to be able to do that, right? Because the crayon requires more pressure, and then the bumpy surface is going to require a stronger grasp. Excuse me. There's a certain level of endurance required for writing. So in addition to strength, you have to keep going. And different people have different abilities in terms of writing endurance. And you need, obviously, both distal and proximal control. So when we're talking about distal and proximal control, I'm talking about distal and proximal control of the body. So you need to be proximally stable and distally mobile, and you need both of those to work together. So the development of handwriting. First, children are going to use larger movements from the more proximal muscles. So again, this is normal development. We go from proximal to distal, from general to specific. You're initially going to be moving the whole arm with a very primitive gross grasp, and then the movement is going to originate more and more and more distally. The control moves outward, just like all other normal development. We go proximal to distal. Eventually, the movement is going to originate in the thumb and fingers of the hand. So if you practice for a second, hold your pencil or pen or whatever you have there on a piece of paper and practice writing vertical lines without moving your fingers at all. Don't move your wrist, don't move your fingers, and you'll notice that most of the movement is coming from your shoulder and elbow, right, when you're doing that. Now you can use your wrist a little bit to make your vertical lines, but still your fingers are not moving, right? So that's a little bit more mature. Now keep your forearm and wrist and ulnar side of your hand stable and make the vertical lines just with your index finger, middle finger, and thumb. So that's the most mature. So we move from using our shoulder and elbow to using our wrist to using our fingertips. And that's what we want to look at in our kiddos when we're analyzing handwriting. We want to look at where is the movement coming from, and that will tell us how mature that writing is. So this is just the practice that you did to remind you to try that out and see what happens when your wrist is up, when your wrist is down, and where the control is coming from. Girls achieve a dynamic tripod about 6 months before boys do. In general, girls are faster to develop their fine motor skills than boys are. Boys are also, in terms of their interest level, much more interested in general in doing physical gross motor activities than girls. This is just in general. There are certainly girls who are much more interested in gross motor skills, and there are certainly boys who are much more interested in fine motor skills in writing. But this is a general sort of rule of thumb that girls achieve it a bit before boys. Now, the dynamic tripod is when you're holding it between the thumb, index finger, and it's resting, the utensil is resting on the internal border, lateral border of the middle finger, And static tripod is when it's moving from the wrist. Dynamic tripod is when it's moving from the fingertips. So it's just the most mature tripod grasp. There are certainly also cultural differences between when kiddos develop mature writing grasps. Also, I want to say that the research has showed us that speed and legibility are not affected by the kind of grasp that a person is using. So we have to realize that there are a large variety of quote-unquote normal grasps. Many of you, if you were to look around the room, and we're going to do this when we're together doing our lab, we're going to look at all the different grasps and analyze what people are doing. And in any group of typically functioning adults, you're going to find a wide variety of pencil grasps. And that's fine. It does not matter what kind of grasp you use, as long as you are not overly tired by it, that it's not a very exhausting grasp, and as long as you are legible in your grasp, that you can read it and someone else can read it. So that's all I really care about. I am not the grasping police. I don't think occupational therapy practitioners should be the grasping police. I think you need to be able to produce legible results with minimal effort. I don't want people getting cramps in their hands from holding too tightly and things like that. But beyond that, I do not care what grasp people use. I will not accept a referral for hand grasp. I won't. I will look and see what's going on, but if the only issue is the grasp and the child's output is legible and they're not distressed by it, they're not having hand cramps or whatever, I don't care what grasp people use. I think it's sometimes people get really stuck on that, on the grasp someone is using if a child is using a very unusual grasp. And they make it into a big deal, and I try to just not care about that too much. I care about the functional aspects of it much more than what it looks like or how pretty it looks. Sometimes it's just a matter of getting a child a writing utensil that works for them. I'm sure all of you have favorite pens and pens that you think work better than others. Some of you probably are more invested in the right pen than others because you might have more issues with endurance, with hand cramping, or with legibility. So you care more about what writing utensil you use. That's fine. There are lots and lots of choices out there. I do not give pencil grasps to children. I will tell you that my experience is that 90% of the time, the kids just grasp around it. They shove it up to the top, or they grasp below the writing, hand grasp thing. And besides which, I don't really care what their grasp looks like. So if they have a functional grasp, I don't really need it to look like a dynamic tripod. I really, really don't. So when you're looking at children and how they're holding a writing utensil, you want to understand if they've been given writing utensils to play with. Have they been given crayons, markers, pens, pencils, chalk, whatever it is? Brushes, paintbrushes are a good beginning thought about that too. So what have the children been given to play with and to experiment with and to try? That's very important. If a child has not been given opportunities to try different kinds of writing utensils, then there are gonna be some delays based on deprivation, environmental deprivation. So take a look at that. And there are different people who have different ideas about when you should give a child something to write with. So make sure that you understand what those cultural, sociocultural differences might be. So even though I don't care what grasp people use, we do have to identify and label them. If somebody has a grasp that is more primitive, but it's working for them, I do not fix it if it's working. But we do have to know how to categorize and label and identify different grasps. So let's go through that. Generally, before 5 years of age, children use primitive grasps. They are power grasps. They're whole hand grasps. So that's when the child is going to be holding the pencil or marker or whatever in a fist, either with their thumb up or with their thumb down. They may be holding it in a fist with their fingers slightly extended, but they're going to be using larger grasps. Transitional grasps are seen usually between 3 and 6 years of age. Again, there's overlap. Some younger children use mature grasps. Some older children don't. So that's why there's a lot of overlap in the time here, the years. Transitional grasps are, we'll talk about them in particular, but the cross thumb, static tripod, and quadrupod are seen around preschool years. And then the mature grasp is seen again in later preschool and early school age years. So what are the primitive grasps? You can look at your handout again that should have pictures of these in it. The radial gross palmar grasp is going to, again, be a whole hand grasp. Palmar supinate means they're holding it and their hand is in slight supination, so the pinky is toward the paper. Digital pronate is going to be still held in the whole hand, but the fingers, the thumb is going to be sort of stabilized at the end and sort of stabilizing the movement. And the thumb is down at the page. And the thumb is usually sticking out a little bit. The index finger may also be pointing down toward the page. A brush grasp is all 4 fingers and thumb around the distal end of, so like the way you would hold a paintbrush. And then extended fingers grasp is sort of like the digital pronate, but the pencil comes out at the web space, which is the space that the thumb creates so let me explain the web space for a sec. If you make an OK sign with your fingers, and there's a circle made by your thumb and index finger when you make that OK symbol, that space at the bottom, at the base of your thumb, where there's a little bit of extra skin, that's your web space. Okay? So an extended fingers grasp is when the writing utensil is in the web space and all 4 fingers are extended and the thumb is extended and they're all around the writing utensil. A static quadrupod grasp is one of the transitional ones, and that's when you have your ring finger, middle finger, and index finger all opposed with your thumb, and they're all like slightly flexed. They're more on the extended side than on the flexed side, if you know what I mean. And then the writing utensil is either vertical or resting back in the web space. Okay, so it is less mature in general to have the writing utensil vertical, and it is considered to be more mature to have the writing utensil resting back in the web space. That's more the typical place for it to be. Now, some people with perfectly fine mature grasp that have legible with minimal effort have their writing utensil completely vertical, so straight up and down. It's in general not considered to be mature that way, but there are plenty of people who do that, so don't get too worried about that. The cross thumb is when the writing utensil is placed in the web space and the index finger is on it, but the thumb, instead of being on the opposite side or pinching the writing utensil with the index finger, the thumb wraps around the front of the index finger. So your thumb wraps and ends up resting on the nail side of your index finger, and the web space is quite closed. It's not completely closed, but it can be. Some people can actually have you can't see the arches or any air in there at all. That's a cross thumb. It's when the thumb's on top. There are lots and lots of people who use a cross thumb grasp. It used to be considered quite immature and quite bad. I don't think of it that way. I think if you can do it, do it. What it does is it limits mobility. If you think about it, think about the traditional dynamic tripod where the thumb and the index finger essentially are pinching, and then it's resting on the internal lateral border of the middle finger. And you have lots and lots of freedom of movement in those distal bits of your fingers. And then if you take that thumb and cross it over the nail of your index finger, then you're going to limit all that movement. So it tends to be thought of as a less mature grasp. Static tripod, again, is the mature grasp. So you're essentially your index finger, pad of your index finger, and pad of your thumb are pinching the utensil, and it's resting on the internal lateral border of your middle finger, like a regular one, but your movement is coming from the wrist and elbow. The movement is not coming from the fingers. So that's why it's static as opposed to dynamic. The dynamic tripod is the same as the one I just discussed, but the movement happens at the fingertip and the thumb. You can look in the book and you'll see the lateral tripod, the dynamic quadrupod, which is all four, also dynamic. These are all mature. The interdigital is between the index finger and the middle finger. And then the index grip is when the index finger is way up high. So look at the pictures in that handout and in your book and make sure that you understand what all these are called. Let's take a minute and look at functional grasps. So that was all handwriting grasps, but there are lots of other grasps. So there are functional grasps that we use on everyday items, and we need to be able to understand these, label them, and analyze them, because sometimes the reason somebody can't perform a particular function is because they're grasping incorrectly on that object. They're using an object that's really for something else, and therefore they're not having success with a task. So we need to know what these are. So a cylindrical grasp is what you would use when you grab a can, right? So essentially you are in neutral pronation, supination. Your hand is open in sort of a sign language C shape, and you're approaching with sort of the middle of your finger, you approach with your elbow. A hammer grasp is exactly what it sounds like. It's what you would use when you're using a hammer. A dowel or knife hold is an oblique palmar, so think about how you hold a knife when you're cutting, if you're going back and forth. The opposed palmar grasp is when you're opening a jar, so your thumb is opposed to your fingers, right? And then you perform simple rotation to open the jar. Palmar grasp is what you would use to grab a piece of cloth. It's that whole hand grasp that you would use if you are picking up a jacket, for example. Excuse me. To grab a shovel handle, you use a transverse palmar grasp. Again, you should have pictures of all these. A ring grasp is like that OK sign. When you are pulling a toothpick out of a container of toothpicks, it's that sort of OK symbol, but the fingers can be a little bit bent. And a spherical grasp is an open grasp that you would do if, like, you're catching a tennis ball. So some functional grasps. So the one before was for power. Functional grasps here are for combined power and precision. So again, the knife grasp, and the ventral grasp is the pull that you use to pull a rope for blinds. So if there is a rope and to open blinds and you pull down on it, that grasp where your thumb is next to the PIP of your index finger and sort of grasping in there, and also inside the fingers of your other finger. So these are precision grasps. We talked about power grasps and functional grasps. Now we're going to talk about precision grasps. So these are more delicate. We are first going to talk about the CD grasp, which is when you grab a CD by the edges. Now this is similar to the spherical grasp when you're catching a tennis ball, but the focus is on the fingertips. So you're going to, with your fingertips, hold that CD. Dynamic lateral tripod is a fork. So if you do a dynamic tripod like you're writing, and then you kind of open it up a little and turn it sideways and supinate just a tad, that's a fork grasp. Inferior pincer grasp is like picking up a grape with the inside part of your fingers, if it's a large grape. Lateral grasp, lateral pinch, lateral grasp, sometimes it's called a lateral pinch. That is when your thumb, like if you're holding a credit card, it's between your extended thumb and your curled index finger, right? That's a credit card grasp. Pad to pad grasp, again, that's the grape, but that's going to be a little further out. Again, the inferior pincer and the pad to pad, they're really quite similar. One is, the inferior pincer is a little proximal and the pad to pad is a little more distal, but don't get too worried about that. Three-jaw chuck we're going to use to turn small knobs. And again, we're going to use simple rotation. So the grasp is a three-jaw chuck and the motion is simple rotation. Tip-to-tip pinch is picking up, again, a hair, a pin, a grain of rice, something like that. Transverse digital is how you're going to hold a violin bow. And the violin bow is going to be held pronated and somewhat ulnar radially deviated, with the fingers spread apart and the thumb opposing those spread apart fingers. So some other grasps that we want to make sure we remember: the functional scissors grasp, which is inside your book, so take a look at that. The hook grasp, which is what you use to hold a suitcase. Interdigital is grasps that are between two fingers without using your thumb. Lumbrical grasps are if you pull yourself forward on the table, you put your fingers on the table and you stop at the fingers are on the table from the MCPs. The rest of your hand is not on the table, just MCPs forward, and your thumb comes under the table and your fingers are a little bit abducted and extended, and then you pull. Raking grasp we talked about earlier on. That's fingers are abducted, hand is open and then closed. And then a non-prehensile grasp would be a light switch. That's when you just use your finger to flick up and down. You use a curled index finger to turn a light switch on and off.